€53 million, one former prime minister. And one question Pedro Sánchez still cannot escape. Why did a small airline with deep Venezuela connections receive public money from the Spanish state? And why is one of PSOE's most important former leaders now under formal investigation over it? José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, Spain's prime minister from 2004 to 2011, is now under judicial scrutiny in the Plus Ultra case. The allegations are serious: influence-peddling, money laundering, a public bailout worth €53 million, and a political relationship with Venezuela that has followed Zapatero for years. Zapatero denies wrongdoing. He has not been convicted. The court has not ruled, and every allegation must be tested through evidence. But the political shock is already real. For the first time in Spain's democratic era, a former prime minister has entered this kind of judicial territory, not as a witness, not as a retired statesman mentioned in someone else's file, but as a central figure in a case that touches public money, political influence, and PSOE's historic legacy. And that is why this is no longer only about Zapatero. It is about Pedro Sánchez. It is about PSOE. It is about whether Spain's ruling party can survive another file opening inside its own political orbit. The case begins with Plus Ultra. During the pandemic, Spain approved a €53 million bailout for Plus Ultra, a small airline operating routes between Spain and Latin America, including the Madrid-Caracas connection. The official argument was that the airline had a strategic value. It preserved connectivity, it protected jobs, it helped maintain Spain's aviation links during one of the most destructive moments in modern travel history. That was the government's explanation. But from the beginning, critics asked a different question. Why this airline? Plus Ultra was not one of Europe's major carriers. It was not a national giant. It was a relatively small company, and critics argued that it was already financially vulnerable before the pandemic. Its Venezuela connections made the case even more sensitive, and that is where Zapatero enters the file. Zapatero had been out of office since 2011, but he never fully left the political stage. Especially on Venezuela, he remained active, visible, and controversial. He visited Venezuela repeatedly. He met with Nicolás Maduro. He positioned himself as a mediator. He defended dialogue when other Western governments were moving toward pressure, sanctions, and isolation. To his supporters, this was diplomacy. To his critics, it was political proximity to a regime Spain should have treated with much more caution. Now those relationships are being examined through a legal lens. The question is not simply whether Plus Ultra received money. That is already known. The question is whether influence helped shape the path that money took. Did political relationships matter? Did Zapatero's access matter? Did his Venezuela connections matter? Did a bailout presented as economic policy contain a deeper political logic? These are allegations. They must be proven in court. But politically, the damage begins before a verdict, because voters do not need a legal textbook to understand the outline of the story. A small airline, a pandemic bailout, €53 million, Venezuela connections, a former socialist prime minister, and a current socialist government under pressure from multiple scandals. That is a dangerous combination. To understand the case, you have to understand the legal language. Influence peddling means using access, status, or political connections to obtain a benefit. It does not require someone to be in office at the time. A former leader can still possess influence. A former prime minister can still open doors. A historic party figure can still move inside networks ordinary citizens never see. That is what makes the allegation so politically explosive. Zapatero was no longer prime minister, but he was not powerless. He had relationships. He had credibility inside parts of the socialist world. He had access to people who mattered. Money laundering is another kind of allegation. It concerns whether funds were concealed, moved, or structured in ways designed to hide their origin or destination. Again, these are allegations. Zapatero denies wrongdoing. The court will determine what can be proven. But the political question is already in the open. Was Plus Ultra a legitimate rescue of a strategic airline, or was it a political favor wrapped inside pandemic emergency policy? That question is now sitting at the center of Spanish politics, and it arrives at the worst possible moment for Pedro Sánchez. His government is already surrounded by pressure. His wife, Begoña Gómez, has faced investigation over allegations involving influence and business activity. His brother, David Sánchez, has also faced legal scrutiny in a separate case. Former Transport Minister José Luis Rodríguez became a major liability for PSOE after corruption-related controversy. Santos Cerdán, another important socialist figure, added to the sense that the party's internal world is under pressure. Each case is legally separate. Each has its own facts. each must be judged individually. But politics does not operate case by case. Politics creates patterns. And the pattern the opposition is now building is simple. Sanchez's political orbit is under judicial pressure, and PSOE can no longer dismiss every file as coincidence. That is why Zapatero's case matters so much. He is not a minor official. He is not a regional advisor. He is not someone PSOE can quietly separate from its identity. Zapatero is part of the architecture of modern Spanish socialism. He led Spain for 7 years. He shaped the party's image. He helped define its international posture. He remains one of the most recognizable socialist figures in Europe. If Sánchez defends him too aggressively, he risks appearing to protect PSOE's old guard. If Sánchez distances himself, he weakens one of the party's most symbolic leaders. If he says nothing, his opponents define the story for him. That is the trap. Silence may look disciplined inside government, but to voters, silence often looks like avoidance. And when the subject is 53 million euros in public money, avoidance becomes dangerous. The opposition understands this. The Popular Party will not frame this as a narrow court proceeding. It will frame it as part of a broader crisis of accountability around Sánchez and PSOE. That is the political battlefield. Not only what Zapatero did or did not do, but why so many names around the socialist universe keep appearing in files, investigations, accusations, and courtrooms. This is not proof of guilt. It is not a conviction. It is not a final judgment. But it is a credibility problem. And credibility is the oxygen of government. Without it, every denial sounds tactical. Every explanation sounds late. Every accusation becomes harder to dismiss. That is where Sánchez is vulnerable. He has survived almost everything in Spanish politics. Party rebellions, electoral setbacks, coalition tensions, separatist negotiations, parliamentary fragility, international criticism, attacks from the right, attacks from inside his own political family. But corruption pressure is different. It accumulates. It does not always destroy a government in one dramatic moment. It works slowly, case by case, headline by headline, hearing by hearing, until the public begins to stop asking whether each individual accusation is true and starts asking a more dangerous question. Why does this keep happening around the same political space? That is the question now facing PSOE, and it is why the Plus Ultra file reaches beyond Spain. For American viewers, this matters because Spain is not a minor local actor. Spain is a NATO member. It is a European Union economy. It is a Mediterranean power. It is one of the main bridges between Europe and Latin America. It is part of the Western system Washington depends on for defense, diplomacy, migration management, and Atlantic stability. When a Spanish government becomes weakened by judicial pressure, that weakness does not stay in Madrid. It affects Brussels. It affects NATO cohesion. It affects Europe's claim to rule of law credibility. It affects how seriously Washington can rely on Spain when hard decisions are required on defense spending, Venezuela, migration, energy, or the wider Atlantic alliance. A government consumed by scandal does not make foreign policy from a position of strength. It makes foreign policy while watching the courts, the press, the opposition, and its own parliamentary partners. That is why this file matters outside Spain. It is a test of whether a Western democracy can investigate its own powerful figures without collapsing into partisan warfare. It is a test of whether former leaders remain accountable after leaving office. And it is a test of whether Pedro Sánchez can continue to govern while the legal pressure around PSOE keeps expanding. If you're finding this useful, subscribe to the Madrid Files, because the next phase of this case may be even more dangerous than the announcement itself. The investigation could bring documents. It could bring testimony. It could bring financial records. It could bring new names. It could force the courts to examine who spoke to whom, who benefited, who knew what, and whether influence played a role in the public rescue of Plus Ultra. That is where the political risk grows. Not because Zapatero has been found guilty, he has not, but because the case creates a public question Sánchez cannot easily answer. Was this bailout a strategic decision, or was it a political favor? That question is devastating because it is simple. The government can talk about aviation policy. It can talk about pandemic emergency measures. It can talk about protecting connectivity with Latin America. It can argue that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary decisions. But voters will still see the same number, 53 million euros, and they will ask why that money went to this company. For Zapatero, the issue is legal survival. For PSOE, it is reputational survival. For Sánchez, it is political survival, because this case touches the oldest problem in politics, whether the people who govern are accountable to the same rules as everyone else. Spain has seen scandals before. Ministers have fallen. Party officials have been investigated. Businessmen have been questioned. Files have opened and closed. But a former prime minister entering a case like this changes the atmosphere. It breaks a psychological barrier. Once that barrier breaks, every old relationship becomes relevant. Every unexplained meeting becomes interesting. Every public contract becomes a possible weapon. Every denial is measured against the next court development. That is the world Sánchez now has to govern inside. He cannot erase the number. He cannot erase the Venezuela connection. He cannot erase Zapatero's role in PSOE history. And he cannot erase the fact that another name from the socialist political universe is now under judicial scrutiny. The court will decide the legal case, but the political case has already begun. A former prime minister now has to explain himself. A current prime minister has to explain his silence. And the ruling party has to explain why another file has opened inside its own political orbit. 53 million euros, one Venezuela-linked airline, one former prime minister, and one question still hanging over Madrid. How many files can Pedro Sánchez survive before the public stops believing this is coincidence? Subscribe to the Madrid Files, because the next file is already open.